He had obviously been talking about some kind of military thing. I went now to London, got on a plane, flew over there, and I went searching. This was my first experience in heartbreaking research. I searched and searched, and I think it took me about 6 weeks, sifting through records before, in the British parliamentary records, I found that there was a group called Colonel O'Hare's forces. His name was Colonel Charles O'Hare, who had been sent with 30-odd men from London to the Gambia River to guard the then British-held Fort James slave fort. There was no question, but that was what the griot had referred to. It had occurred in early 1767, so this gave me a time frame. It had to have been around in that area of time that Kunta had been captured. Now I begin another search, the incredibly involved, the incredibly difficult, and incredibly frustrating search for what ship was it. I went to Lloyd's of London. The fact that I'd been in the Coast Guard 20 years was helpful with any maritime people. I finally got to a very high official, and I remember I was talking with this man, and he was sitting behind his desk, and I remember his eyes kind of falling in a way that made me kind of look down, and I realized I'd never had realized I was just tears draining down on my shirt as I poured out of me the passion, the fervor, the drive of trying to pull together the history of a people. And finally the man stood up. His name was Mr. R.C.E. Landers. And he said, "Young man, Lloyd's of London will do all we can to help you." And it was he and they who began to open up to me doors to places where there are records of slave ships. There are more records of slave ships than one would dream. It seems inconceivable until you reflect that for 200 years ships sailed carrying cargoes of slaves. And there are boxes of them, the records, which have never even been opened. Nobody's had occasion particularly to go into them lately. And anyway, to compress, I worked for about 7 solid weeks. Finally, I was in the 1023rd set of slave ship records in the Public Records Office in London. One afternoon, going down across this sheet that had 30 ships' movements on it. And I went on down, and my eye came to number 18, all of it in this old-fashioned handwriting. You have to adjust to it. My eye would go out to the right, as it had with endless before cases of the same thing. And I looked out, and there was destination Annapolis. And somehow, it didn't really grab me at the moment. I remember I took the little information, picked up the records, went back and turned them in properly, and went on out. Around the corner from the Public Records Office is a little tea and cruller shop. I got me some tea and a cruller, and I was sitting there sort of sipping the tea and swinging my foot like it's all in a day's work, when it suddenly hit me, maybe I had indeed found that ship. I still owe that lady for that tea and cruller. I went out of there like a shot. I got to a telephone and called. I got the last available seat on the 6 o'clock flight to New York. And I got on that plane that night. There was not even time to go back to the hotel to get my stuff if I was to make that flight, and I didn't go back. And I flew that ocean that night, sitting up, sleepless, seeing in my mind's eye the book I had to get my hands on. I could see it. I'd had it in my hands. I had a light brown back, dark brown letters, shipping in the port of Annapolis by Vaughan W. Brown. I got to New York, took the shuttle flight to Washington, Library of Congress, got this book. Flipping through it, there was one line in agatype intended to support. That was in fact the ship. And I just about went berserk. In time, I would get to the author of that book, Vaughan Brown. He was a broker in Baltimore. He dropped what he was doing. He left his office, got in his car, he drove to Annapolis, and he helped me pin down that was indeed the ship. I worked there in the Maryland Hall of Records, St. John's College campus, and different things, little bit here, little card file here, Phoebe Jacobson, a master archivist, helped me find things. And then the area widened. I was in New England at Peabody Museum, Widener at Harvard, various other places, moving around, and then I was crossing the ocean again. There was one period when I made 3 round trips over the ocean in a 10-day period. It never occurred to me to telephone or to cable. I had to go. Somebody might miss it. You had to go. And it was pulling together a thread here, a little bit there, of about that ship, to recreate the ship which brought Kunta Kinte and which symbolized the ship, or the ships, which had brought so many, many, many out of Africa over such a long period of time. Finally, I got together. Her name was Lord Ligonier. She was named for a British field marshal. She was built in this country in 1765, probably in New Hampshire. She came out of Maryland and sailed with a cargo of rum, a skeletal crew of 16, her captain, Captain Thomas Davies, Davies, and she sailed to Gravesend, England. She was a brand new ship, maiden voyage. They sold the rum, used the proceeds to buy the slaving hardware and the foodstuffs they would need, and to put on a full crew, 36. And she sailed out of Gravesend, and she was moving on up now on her way. I could read the captain's mind. He had a brand new ship. He'd been entrusted with command. He wanted to make the quickest possible trip to get the best possible cargo of slaves and get back to look good to the people who had entrusted him with such a command. And he's moving on up the channel, and as he moved on up, the weather began to grow bad. I was tracking her. There were different places I could get the records of. One thing about England, it gave us the greatest system of civil service. And one thing about civil servants is they're always writing something. And there are records on end. And the records would let me track her. She was making pretty good time. She was doing about 5.2 knots. I could see her in my mind's eye. She was of ship rig. Her timbers were hackmatack cedar. Her planking was loblolly pine. The flax in her sails was grown in New Jersey. The nails that held her together were not really nails as we know them, but they were called trunnel, tree nails, dowel pegs of black locust split in the top with a wedge of white oak, and it will outlast an iron fastening. And she was moving on up that coast, and she was doing good, and then I came upon the thing that for God's sake she dropped the anchor. And I nearly had a fit. Why on earth would he drop the anchor? I knew the man was trying to make a good, fast trip. And it threw me into a dither. Why did she stop? And I began to think now that ships then had no engines. All ships were sail ships. So if I was to know why she stopped as well as why she went, what I had to know was more than I knew about weather. So I dropped everything. I found out the British Meteorological Headquarters is in a city called Bracknell, England. And I got on a train, went over there. I remember it was a Thursday afternoon. You get off the train, there's a little rise, and then a high iron wall and a big gate. And I got in through that gate about half an hour before they closed. And I remember rushing in there and telling these people, look, I have got to have this weather for the spring, summer 1766. And they looked at me as if I was crazy. And I just couldn't understand why did not they have what I had to have. There was no question but what I had to have it. And I went back to London that night as deep in despair as I had been up to that point. When I got back to the hotel, I got a hold of the little bellman. They say a hotel bellman can get you anything. And this, I don't drink much, but this time I told this fellow I had to have a bottle of, I didn't care what. He got me a bottle of that Puerto Rican rum that looks like molasses. I don't know where he got it from. And by morning it was gone. Well, it was 3 days before I was functional again, and it was a good thing. I felt as if I was a total failure if I couldn't find what I had to know, why did that ship stop? And then I got to thinking about something. I guess Linus Blanket for me kind of is Grandma. Long gone she is, but whenever I get in any strain, my mind goes back to my grandma. I'm very close to anybody's grandma because it symbolized my own. And when I got to thinking about grandma in this little hotel, then I got to thinking about Henning, the town in which we lived, and then about how our town was structured around its church and its school. All little southern towns are. And I got to thinking about something about church in particular, was that among our congregation at New Hope CME Church was a lady named Sister Willada Curry. And everybody in Henning knew that Sister Willada was the best prayer in town. There was no question. After church every Sunday when I grew up, I don't know how this thing started, but it grew up with me. Sister Willada always wore a dress to church that had two big pockets, one on either side. And after church, out in the churchyard, people moving around as they do, rather in the spirit that people today will go drop a coin in a fountain for good luck or something. With Sister Willada, people would sort of sidle up by her, and all they do is make certain she saw who they were, and they drop a nickel in one of these pockets. And the general feeling about it was that meant you would be included in her general weekly prayer, and it couldn't hurt, you know. Now, if somebody had a particular problem, they would let her see it was a dime and drop in there. And if it was something catastrophic, you'd give her a quarter, and that meant you had a pipeline, sort of. Well, I got to thinking about that, laying up in this little room in a hotel in London. And I knew it was crazy, and yet everything else was crazy, it seemed. And it seemed hopeless. And I got on the phone. It is an experience to hear an international operator getting through to the United States in the first place, information, getting Henning, Tennessee, and finally getting the phone number of Willada Curry. I knew she was still there, hadn't seen her in so long. Finally, she's on the phone. We are on the phone. It didn't take very long for me to establish who I was. Of course, she knew me as soon as I got straight which young'un I was. Then she was confused about, she wasn't quite sure what London was, but she knew it was somewhere across the water, and we got that settled. And then I recalled what she used to do, and she said, yes, and I still does that. And then I told her, I said, Sister Willada, I'm over here, and I need a big prayer. Honey, I need a big prayer. And so she listened, and then I told her, I said, Sister Willada, when we get done, I'm going to send you $100. And she never blinked. She said, son, it sure is good talking with you, but you hang up, because I'm going to start right now. I don't know exactly what she prayed, but I'll tell you what happened. An idea came to me. I got to thinking that I needed to get any kind of valid weather data that I could document between April and September 1766 in that strip of ocean between the English Channel and the Gambia River. I went and got me a big blank meteorological chart, figured just mark that strip of ocean that any ship sailing that particular destination would have to go through. And now I begin to get on to trains and go to every city in England that in the 1760s had been a major seaport, Liverpool, Hull, the others. And when I'd get off the train, I'd go in those cities to everything that looked like a library. This was when I began to strike up what I like to think of now as a love affair with librarians. I discovered something about librarians that most people, I think, take librarians pretty much for granted, take libraries themselves pretty much for granted. But I found out that if you can excite a librarian, if you can make a librarian share your passion for something you've got to find, they can turn detective and do things that neither you nor they would normally think. Once I could get them to understand what I was trying to do, librarians got really excited about what I was trying, and they sent me to places which are now like a blur in the memory. Old warehouses, old shipping record places, homes of seafaring people who had collected logs of ships, all kinds of places. And I would go, and I was looking for one thing, the log of any ship of any kind which at any time between April and September 1766 had been in my strip of ocean. And I knew one thing, having been an old sailor and having done a lot of work in old ship records, that in the days of sailing ship, every time they changed the watch on a ship, they record the longitude and the latitude and the weather. And whenever I'd find in any of these logs a ship that had been in my strip of ocean in those months, I would pluck out the longitude, latitude, and with my little stuff I could pinpoint where she was when she made a specific weather reading. And I could reduce that weather reading to the symbols. And in that way, 3 weeks about, I had 411 weather readings scattered over that strip of ocean. I went back to Bracknell and got 2 lieutenant commanders, Royal Navy, and showed it to them, and they became engrossed with it. It was like a double acrostics puzzle. And then they went in with colleagues, and with the modern weather prognosis methods, they were able to recreate the weather in which the Lord Ligonier had sailed. I found that the reason she had dropped anchor was a very valid one. She had been coming out of Gravesend, and the weather had been getting worse on her, and she came to that point where you have to make a starboard turn, and where they needed east in the wind to make that turn safely. But the wind had shifted to southwest. She had to drop the anchor, because if she hadn't, she would have been in danger of drifting over into an area called the Goodwin Sands. And she laid in there waiting for the wind to shift. And she waited and waited until finally it was July 5th, 1766. She was in 8 fathoms of water. It was a Tuesday morning. The millibar reading was 10:10. The weather was a drizzle becoming fair, and the wind shifted east-northeast. And that was the day she ran up the sails. She went on down now past Shakespeare Cliff, past the White Cliffs of Dover, Dungeness, Beely Head, down to Lizard's Head, and into the open sea. She went southeasterly across the Bay of Biscay, down to the Cape Verdes, the Canaries, and then she made the bend upwards and came up to the Gambia River. She would spend the next 10 months in that Gambia River slaving. At the end of 10 months, she had a cargo, 3,265 elephant's teeth, as they called ivory tusks, 3,700 pounds of beeswax, 800 pounds of raw cotton, 32 ounces of gold, 140 Africans. And with that cargo, she set sail July 5th, 1767. It was a Sunday. She sailed directly to Annapolis. She arrived in Annapolis, and when she got in there, I knew of her coming in there because I went now to Annapolis, and I went into one set of records that you can generally find back to the time of Christ, and that's tax records, to find out what had she declared for tax when she got in there. The captain was very honest. He declared everything that he declared on leaving the fort in the Gambia River, the James Fort, whose ruins I had seen. He now declared in Annapolis everything there but the original 140 Africans had become 98 who had survived the voyage, which was about average for slave ships. Another little interesting side thing I happened to sort of stumble upon in the course of the research was that percentage-wise, more whites, crew, died on slave ships than slaves did. The Lord Ligonier would bear it out. She had left England with a full crew of 36, and she arrived in Annapolis with 18 of them alive. At that time, I knew that if you had cargo as valuable as slaves to sell, then as now, one would advertise. And I went now looking for the records of the media of the day. I went into the microfilm records of the Maryland Gazette, the issue of October 1st, 1767. Page 3, the far left column, the third ad down, there was the Lord Ligonier's ad, placed by its agents, that she had, quote, just arrived from the river Gambia with fresh slaves to be sold the following Wednesday. And then that auction was held. Now I had one thing left to pin down beyond any question, that the miracle indeed had been achieved through the help of God. That's the only way I can feel about it. I had to be able to pin down that without question that was the same African I'd heard about. And my clue now went back to the front porch in Henning, Tennessee, that always Grandma and Aunt Liz and Cousin George and Aunt Plus and Aunt Viney and all of them would talk about this African always had rejected the name Toby, which he had been given by his master. And I knew that they had always said that Massa John Waller bought him off the ship, and later, after his foot had been cut off, Massa William Waller, the brother of John, had bought him from his brother. It was oral history kept down across generations of a black family in America. And I had had things now which tended to make me put great reliance in what Grandma had said. I didn't doubt it at all anymore, but the thing was try and document it. I went now to Richmond, Virginia, and got again into that experience of working in that world of the old-fashioned handwriting, the F's like S's. I'm working now in the longhand legal deeds of the 1760s, Spotsylvania County, Virginia. And I searched and searched and searched, and I believe it was in the fourth week that I found what I had been looking for. There it was, a deed dated September 5th, 1768. Kunta Kinte by that time would have been 11 months in this country, or colonial America. And there was the deed, Spotsylvania County, Virginia, between William Waller on the one part and John Waller and his wife on the other, transferring from John and his wife Ann to William goods. The first page dealt with the transfer of 240-odd acres of land, the fences and other things on that land. And then on the second page, I think it was about the fifth line down, between two commas, were the words, quote, and also one Negro man slave named Toby. And that brought it full circle. There was no question. It was gulpy. It was my God time. The rest of the research, I could stand up here 6 hours, I guess, and talk, but I'm not going to do that. It would just be telling about what happened in the way of the research, the drama, the adventure of it, across 9 years, finally to flesh out the book that took another 3 years to write, the book called Roots. I've tried to share with people a lot about the history of black people. And when I got myself very aware of the history of black people, I began to reflect upon how little I had known at the outset. What a hoax I felt had been pulled on me by many forces, that I had gotten to be a grown man and knew next to nothing about my own people, that all I had known about Africa, the ancestral culture of us, had, as I say, been drawn from Tarzan, Jungle Jim sort of things, and that I knew little about slavery, really. And then I got to reflecting that if this had been the case with me, what did I know about other people? And I just got curious, me, black, but me, human being, about other peoples. So what I began to do was just for me to go into the libraries, with which I'm pretty familiar by now, and just do a little peripheral study about virtually every ethnic group of the peoples who comprise the population of this United States of America. And what I begin to discover, and what collectively I know has enriched me as few things I have, at least so I feel, is that it does not matter who they are, from whence they came, but every single ethnic group in this country, if you go back and you study and you know about that group of people in whatever was their old country, their trials, their problems, their tribulations, their frustrations, in some cases persecutions, if you know about the hope, the beacon that America represented, about the time they came to the immigrant generation, and then the generation that got here and assimilated, that what you deal with every ethnic group on the face of this country is a thrilling, stirring human drama in this nation of immigrants, in which black people happen to be the only unwilling immigrants. None of us ever must forget that blacks were the only ones who came here in chattel slave status and in chains in this nation of immigrants. And then I reflected about how it seems to me that all of us, every one of us, it does not matter who, have a stake in something that I thought to be one of the most stirring, moving, dramatic, heartrending things I came upon in the study of the culture of Africa for the book Roots. And that was the thing that had to do with how the babies were named. In this land that we have all heard about as heathens and savages peopling it, that in this land, 200, 300, 400 years ago, in any little village, when a baby was born, the people of the village would not see much of the father for 7 days, because he was occupied with going about, keeping pretty much to himself, thinking up a good, meaningful, significant name for this infant. And bear in mind, these are these heathens and savages we've heard so much about, and that these babies are the ancestors of we black people here today. On the 8th day, the people of the village would gather at that particular little circular mud-walled home with the thatched roof. And there would be a stool sitting just outside. The people brought with them, in the Mandinka culture anyway, a jalabar, a drummer, who brought a cylindrical drum called the tantang. And then they had another man there who was the equivalent of our minister. They called him the alemamo. And the jalabar would give a roll on his drum, and the people would stand rigidly at attention. A second roll on the drum, and the mother, who had been inside waiting for that signal, now would step out and sit herself on this stool, holding the little 8-day-old black infant, these heathens and savages. The third roll on the drum, and the alemama would step forth and bless the gathering, because this had happened to everybody there when they were 8 days of age. And then the next roll, the father would come from the bush. He was waiting somewhere just for this signal. And now this father would walk over with every eye on him, his fellow villagers, his neighbors, his tribesmen, and he would walk over to where the mother sat holding this little 8-day-old infant. And the father now would bend, and he would lift up this infant, and he would turn it so that one of its ears was very close to his lips. And into that tiny ear, that father would whisper the name he had selected 3 times. And the thinking of these alleged heathens and savages in doing it this way was that the individual thus named always would be the first to know who he was. Those are the ancestors of us as a people. And it seems to me that the symbolism for us all, having nothing to do with our race, whatever race we may be, but just us people as human beings, it seems to me the potential of us and the symbol for us is contained in the second part of the baby naming ceremony. And that was that night when the father, now alone, would take his infant a distance away from the village, and he would hold it up so that its face, its eyes looked up toward the firmament, the stars and the moon. And the father would speak to his infant, again the symbol for us all and our potentials, the quote, "Behold the only thing greater than thyself." Thank you.